Greetings and welcome to Trinity Radio. I'm Jonathan Pritchett, and today we have Dr. Tim Stratton, fellow colleague and professor, and just a really good friend of mine on the program to respond to some Calvinists who made a response to some questions we asked. Dr. Stratton, how are you doing?
Doing great, Dr. Pritchett. How are you doing?
I'm a little bit nauseated, and it's not because I had to listen to their responses while I edited the clips, but I think I'll be able to power through.
Well, good. I hope so. We'll help each other.
Yeah. I've kind of enjoyed this series so far. It hasn't been without any drama that we'll have to address at some point, but I've enjoyed it, and we try to respond in an informative and yet entertaining and sometimes a little bit fun and snarky way. So with that, do you have anything you want to say before we jump into the first clip?
No, not really. I'm glad to finally be here with you doing this. I think you wanted to do this a while ago, but I've been on kind of a national tour. I spent a week in Utah doing some missionary work, sharing the gospel with Mormons with a bunch of teenagers.
Amen.
Then I went to Florida, had the opportunity to speak to a Christian school there on the free thinking argument and the divine or the deity of deception arguments. And then I went to North Carolina to the EPS conference there, and I presented a paper called "Is Divine Determinism a Different Gospel?" to a room full of PhD philosophers and theologians at this conference. And many of these folks were these PhDs were divine determinists. So I had a blast interacting with them, and it was so much fun, made some great friends, and I'm looking forward to continue this conversation here with you today.
Yeah, so what it sounds like is I've been doing other things that are actually important, but now I have time to do this.
Well, as you know, I've not gotten my grades in on time, so thanks for giving me grace there. But yeah, I'll focus on that tomorrow.
Yeah, well, good. And before we get started, speaking of grades, I want to alert that if you have ever considered going to seminary, or if you think you might go in the future or to get a seminary degree, or even just a certificate so that you can expand your knowledge and be of greater assistance to your local church in teaching and fellowship and discipleship, I want you to consider going to Trinity College of the Bible and Theological Seminary at trinitysem.edu, where both of us are professors, along with Dr. Braxton Hunter, Jim Chatham, Chris Featherstone, Roy Hartness, and a bunch of other people. Get mad if I didn't mention you. It's fine. I can take
Braxton Hunter.
Did I not say? Well, who
I don't
cares?
think you said Braxton.
Well, he's just he's just the president. He teaches like one. No, he's a good professor. He teaches any number of courses. But yeah, you can actually go to trinitysem.edu, fill out an evaluation form, and you can learn from the comfort of your own home and at a price you can afford with professors you've actually heard of. So there's my speech, and we'll get into the first video. You ready?
Let's do it.
Here we go.
Is the biblical case for exhaustive divine determination, or what I call EDD or ED, right? What's the biblical case for ED? The idea that God determines all things about humanity, from our physical actions to our mental states.
Incompatibilists will often say that the idea of something being determined and free is a logical contradiction. And I've pointed out to Leighton before, while this doesn't demonstrate
I think there's a problem with the video.
compatibilism, this doesn't demonstrate compatibilistic determinism.
Okay, hang on.
But what is the biblical case for exhaustive divine determination, or what I call EDD or ED, right? What's the biblical case for ED? The idea that God determines all things about humanity, from our physical actions to our mental states.
Incompatibilists will often say that the idea of something being determined and free is a logical contradiction. And I've pointed out to Leighton before, while this doesn't demonstrate this doesn't demonstrate compatibilistic determinism is true, I only need one instance of something being both determined and free to disprove they're logically incoherent. So, for example, when it says that Judas and Pontius Pilate and all those men were determined to do what they did, Acts chapter 2 and Acts chapter 4, right? Does that prove compatibilistic determinism? No, but it does disprove the notion that they're logically inconsistent according to the scripture, because those things are said to be determined, and it is also said that Judas chose those things freely, that Pontius chose those things freely, and so on and so forth. That's the kind of thing that, if that only happens one time, incompatibilism is no longer compatible with the scripture, right? Now, you can be an incompatibilist, or you can be a compatibilist rather, and still not a determinist, so there's still more room here that we need to work with, right? But I think that, like, when you start putting together the different things like that, another instance I would go to very quickly is just to say, Genesis chapter 50, Genesis chapter 48, Genesis chapter 37 in collection with each other, the whole story of Joseph. It's quite clear that Joseph's brothers decided to do what they did. It's also quite clear that Joseph is so convinced that this was God's determined plan that he goes as far as to say, actually, you didn't even send me here. God sent me here, right? And again, I only need one of those instances to prove that incompatibilism is not compatible, pun intended, with the text.
Tim?
All right. Well, So I'm going to back up. I took a lot of notes yesterday. I did not have a chance to watch this video until you sent it to me. And so I finally got through it yesterday. You know, I've been, like I said, touring the nation. And so I went through and I took a lot of notes, some of which are here and in this clip and some that aren't. So first thing I want to address is that CJ, by the way, I just want to give a shout out to CJ. He and I are usually in perfect agreement on where the theology and theology and politics intersect. And so I just want to give him a shout out there. And I think that that's actually the most important thing, way more important than this. But let's discuss this. At one point, he said that there's no point in using the term exhaustive divine determinism. And I shortened that down to just say ED, EDD or ED. And he said, hey, it's either determinism or it's not. And first, I just want to say that using the word exhaustive helps people understand exactly what we're talking about. I've found this to be the case, even among PhD philosophers who talk to me about the subject. In fact, just last weekend, I read a forthcoming paper on this topic, as I said, at the EPS in North Carolina. And again, it was clear that people often confuse the idea that some things are determined with all things are determined. And this is even among scholars. So clarification helps. For example, people confuse soteriological determinism with exhaustive determination. And many times people don't factor mental actions into their view of determinism. Indeed, the people who are complaining about me seeking clarity with the use of the word exhaustive are often the ones guilty of, muddying the waters in the first place. I've never seen so many folks gnashing their teeth because I sought to bring clarity to a very confusing situation. It's mind-blowing. I don't get it. But with that said, let me be clear. I'm not against some or even most things being determined. I hold a position similar to Robert Keynes, and I simply argue that the entirety of human mental actions cannot be determined, and that we must possess libertarian freedom if we are to possess metaphysical and theological knowledge. Now, after hearing this clarity, the philosophers at the EPS last week, and even last year at another presentation at the EPS, where I presented a different but related paper, these scholars have zero problems with this term once I explain it. It really only seems to be an issue with non-philosophers on the internet, like what we see here. Now, second, recently, to avoid these lame objections to me seeking clarity, I've used the term exhaustive divine determination, not determinism. In fact, I used that exact term in the video that these four guys are complaining about. So they weren't careful, they didn't listen closely, and they merely responded in haste, it seems. They could have done otherwise and been more careful, but then I guess Ed would be false. But anyway, so yeah, did I answer CJ's question there? I can't really remember.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. I wanted to make a couple of comments. And John Q. Public kind of only needs one example. I find his way of arguing here, technically he's correct. And this was like Tim Barber's approach in the other direction with Dr. James White, because he said, if you assume what you call ED, like all things are determined or decretalism or whatever, but he finds one example that's false, then White's position is false. It's an interesting tactic. And he's kind of right in the sense that if he does find anywhere where something is determined and that they made those choices freely, that proves that compatibilism is coherent. That's fine. Yeah. My issue with him is his understanding of Genesis 50:20, Acts chapter 2, Acts chapter 4. And there's always this equivocation fallacy that takes place, that just because God has determined something to take place doesn't mean that it falls out and takes place deterministically. Right? That's, I mean, and I think Molinist, that's their entire argument anyway. Yeah. But I mean, like, I determine things all day long. It doesn't mean that I deterministically have them happen for me. Even if I determined to make this podcast, today, that doesn't mean that it's deterministically happening. So just because even with God, it doesn't mean that just because God determined that Jesus suffered on the cross and lists all the actors that were involved in that, doesn't mean that that's determinism. It just means that those are the people involved to do the very thing that his plan and his mighty hand determined to take place. And if you go to Acts chapter 2, it's according to his plan and foreknowledge, right? So
Right.
And then 50-20, just because God intended a thing and they intended a thing doesn't mean that they didn't intend for different reasons and different ends. I do that all day long too. They probably meant their response to own us, and we intended their response to give us another opportunity to own them. And I'm being facetious, guys. So, I mean, this kind of language, you can dump your metaphysics into it. So he's right in the sense that if that's the best reading of those texts, which I reject outright,
Right.
but he's right in the sense that, yeah, that doesn't prove that these things are incompatible, but he's just wrong because that's not what those texts are saying. And
I've been clear that I do not reject some form of compatibilism. This is on my website. I've done videos about this as well. I would
love for you and Braxton to fight about this. That would be fun.
Well, actually, Braxton started. It was because of Braxton that I wrote this whole article, because he got into it with some other Calvinist determinists. And actually, I've got a book coming out about this as well. But compatibilism is the thesis that some kind of freedom and or moral responsibility is compatible with determinism. And I have affirmed some of that. Again, Robert Kane and I have very similar views on that. What I have gone further to demonstrate, along with the help of J.P. Moreland, is that theological and metaphysical knowledge is not compatible with exhaustive divine determination, or ed, nor is it compatible with exhaustive naturalistic determination.
Well, I prefer to say determinism as opposed to determination, because
I've got a reason for that, and
it can be confusing and cause the very equivocation fallacy. So state your reasoning for that, why you're using that term,
right,
as opposed to the ism, because the ism seems more familiar to lay audiences, I think.
Yeah, because as I noted earlier, so many people confuse soteriological determinism with determinism writ large, or across the board. And that's why I started saying exhaustive divine determinism. And then folks like these guys were, started gnashing their teeth and it's redundant. You don't need it. I'm like, well, then how come almost every philosophical conference I speak at, do I find even scholars needing this clarification? And so then if I say, because again, like you mentioned, God can determine some things without determining all things. I believe God does determine a whole bunch of things. I believe maybe most of the things about me are determined, and I have a kind of freedom that is compatible with that, but it's not the kind of freedom that allows moral basically rational and epistemic responsibility. It does not allow theological and metaphysical knowledge. And that's what we're doing here, is we're trying to gain metaphysical and theological knowledge. So this is a reason to reject the view of ed or any kind of determinism, or the reason why I use determination is because people seem to be able to find not have a problem with God determining some things. So you could say, well, that event was determined, while not saying that God determines all things. So if one wants to say divine determinism simply means exhaustive divine determinism, fine. Or if they'd like for clarity, you can just say exhaustive divine determination, which what I mean by that is God is determining all things. So really, I'm getting tired of these semantic arguments and complaints. Deal with the big ideas, and let's move this conversation forward.
One of the things that I appreciate about your specificity with what you mean with your terms is because not even all Calvinists agree on how providence works, because there's a fundamental difference between a John Piper and a William G.T. Shedd, and he's or Edwards is different from all. There's a spectrum of hard to soft determinism within Calvinism, and then some Calvinists who are not as philosophically astute as like a Piper or a Edwards or a Shedd or a John MacArthur will just talk about antinomy, like J.I. Packer or something, and just like, well, I mean, it's free, and then this, and somewhere down the line, those train tracks, and just kind of foul it off like that. So, yeah, it's important to actually state what we're talking about with specificity, which I guess the people at ETS appreciate. I appreciate it too, because I see that Calvinism has a wide variety of how they understand providence. And I think there was a book by Muller. I can't remember the title. I never remember the name of that book.
I bought that book for James White and gave it to him as a gift before our debate.
And it was like the pre-Edwards tradition of providence and free will and all of that. And it's the variegated views that existed then, I still would assert exist now. Mm-hmm. So, and I think it's right to highlight that. It's just some of the loudest voices in the discussions tend towards the harder forms of determinism than the Calvinists. Yeah.
Yeah, and I made that clear in my when I read my paper this last weekend at EPS. And I don't know if you've got this clip, but in the original video, our colleague and friend Chris Date said that he's not going to use the term ed. He's just going to use the term that everybody else uses in the literature. And he says, and that's theological determinism. Yeah. And then he adds, and by the way, ed is a mouthful or something like that. And I just want to say here that out of all, everybody in this discussion, I'm the only one here who is actually contributing to the academic literature on this topic. And I, along with J.P. Moreland, maybe they've heard of him before, we have introduced the term ed in the academic literature in an attempt to clarify and to purify the muddied waters. And by the way, to Chris's comments, ed is not superfluous, nor is it a mouthful.
Well,
I'll just say it's one syllable, and theological determinism is 10 syllables, so it's easier to say. But he also is worried about me using the term trying to compare ed to erectile dysfunction. And no, it has nothing to do with that. It has to do with the fact that my conversations with so many determinists, I saw that they were unintentionally assuming their ability to be free thinkers in a libertarian sense. So I noted that determinism applies to the exhaustive, and then I started using the word exhaustive. That quickly clarified and rectified the situation. And then I did think it was nice because I believe that Jonathan Edwards, to your point, was the first one to really make the idea of ed, or exhaustive divine determinism, clear, or determination clear. So Edwards equals ed. I thought that was kind of cool, but it has nothing to
Apparently no one else does. So
no, right.
Well, maybe some people at ETS. Well, let's go to the next clip and see.
Okay.
This is still the same question you asked, but it's I can't remember now. But we'll see. It might be what Chris was saying.
A human.
No, it's this will be Israel.
Okay. No, but seriously, I do think there's a level of, and I don't know if this is Tim's intention, but there is a level of this question, this line of argument, deity deception, kind of appeals to your more emotive way of reasoning. You know what I mean? Like, you're saying God's a deceiver, and therefore you must be wrong. And I think it gets people to leave their mind and start thinking with their heart, if that makes sense, which is always dangerous in conversations like this. Again, I don't know if that's what Tim's intending to do, but I do think the argument does have that effect on people, and that does make it a fairly popular one.
Right.
Are you arguing from emotion?
No, not at all. There's zero line of emotion in my arguments. It's just based on logic. And in fact, I really came to appreciate this last week at the EPS. I realized that some of my arguments, they touch nerves, because I'm discussing people's deeply they're deeply held or beliefs, I guess. And so it can hurt. I remember when I was a Calvinist, when I was first confronted with arguments against Calvinism, I recoiled. I wanted to fight back, and I did. I fought this fight for a year before.
Actually, I'm going to cut you off. I think I played that out of order. I'm having issues here.
Yeah, I think you did play that out of order.
We'll get to that. Here's the second part of what they. Sorry, CJ Cox. We'll get there, because that's part of another answer. Because they were each responding until they eventually gave that up and decided to let one or two people respond. So I'm trying to get them all in there. So
if it helps, I have their.
Well,
I mean, you probably want to play the videos,
yeah.
But if it helps, I've got their quotes up here with my notes underneath it, so I can just quote them.
Yeah, we'll see what this.
It's a rational soul in a human body.
Okay.
So premise 1, a human person is a rational soul in a human body. Premise 2, if the Son assumed a soul and body, then the Son assumed a human person. The Son assumed a soul and a body. Does the Son assume a human person? if the Son assumed a human person, then there are two people or two sons in Jesus Christ. Thus, there are two people or sons of Jesus Christ. But if there are two people or sons in Jesus Christ, then the one son rule is false. So pretty much it's arguing from Christology, which can be derived from the Bible. So that's why it stays biblical. Like we get the idea that Christ has a soul, as he has to be completely human. The thing is that if you have libertarian free will and this soul of Jesus would have its own agency, I guess when the second person of the Trinity is united to this soul, either the soul loses agency, or if it doesn't lose agency, then you have two persons. You have the second person of the Trinity, which incarnated, and then you have the soul, which was assumed with the hypostatic union with the second person of the Trinity. So in this sense, if you have more than three persons, then you don't have a Trinity, and then it is not biblical. And then the answer that Ryan Mullins gives is usually to just give out classical theism altogether, which is I think is quite extreme.
So I learned from the past 2 weeks, don't play Israel at 1.5 speed. So his clips might be a little bit longer. So one of the things that he's trying to argue here is that from Christology, some form of compatibilism or determinism is necessary. You fall into some sort of heresy.
Yeah, that's absurd. I mean, first, was he appealing to Ryan Mullins, who?
Yeah, he brought that up. Yeah,
rejects Israel's view.
Yeah, but he was saying that's an abandonment of classical theology, which he thinks we shouldn't want to do.
Okay. Well,
because it's bad, right? It's bad. It's really bad if you become neoclassical or something. It's like,
okay, well,
God's caring about whether you're the God of the philosophers meshed with Christianity or no. I'm just kidding. I consider myself. I think I fall in so much as I care, which I don't. I think I fall in the neoclassical theology. Neoclassical theism type thing, but I don't really care that much. But you go ahead.
I'll let people label me whatever they want, but I think I heard in the original, I don't know if you did hear that Israel made a passing comment about Dr. William Lane Craig's view, which Craig dubs neo-Apollinarianism, not to be confused with plain old Apollinarianism. And Israel says that I think he said that was heretical. And while I agree that plain old Apollinarianism is heretical, neo-Apollinarianism is not. It's a different thing, hence the word neo, right? It changes it. So I just want to refer people to the source and tell people to carefully read Philosophical Foundations for a Christian Worldview by William Lane Craig and J.P. Moreland, and tell me if Israel's accusations here stand. And I'd say spoiler alert, they don't. And just quickly, in a nutshell, I say the second person of the Trinity is the immaterial aspect of Jesus, which, with substance dualism in mind, provides a human nature, a body-soul construct. I think in the original I heard Israel saying something about combining of souls, and that's at the end of the day going to be incoherent. Second, combining that with things like, Craig brings up with like blind sight analogies and things like that, show that we can possess knowledge without being cognizant of the knowledge we possess. Thus, in Jesus' human nature, Jesus was not cognizant of everything. He knew about everything and still remains omniscient. So, and at the same time can still grow in knowledge and stature, as Scripture says. So it's a way to make sense of that philosophically, and making sense of all the theological and biblical data as well. So anyway, did I answer Israel's?
I think so. I just wanted to point out that if it's not Nicaea or Constantinople or Chalcedon or Ephesus, I don't care what non-ecumenical councils on YouTube declare anything.
Right.
Neither should anyone else. But so that wraps up that I think that was the first question that you had offered in our video.
I mean, if you don't mind, I think there's a lot that was said there that I would like to get to. I think Colton Carlson added some things. I'm ready to talk about all of this if you'd like, or we can skip it.
Yeah, let's just keep going, and then at the end we can address some things in your notes. But let's get to the video portions, because we want get them in as well so that we can respond to these clips. I mean, they stream for over 3 hours, so there's no way to get to everything. But you have a channel. Just kidding.
Yeah, I do have a channel. Maybe I'll do that. So
well, actually, I think that some of these things probably require their own video that would be helpful.
Oh yeah. Otherwise, this will be a 6-hour video. So I get it.
No, but I have a lot of this stuff already chopped up. Like I sent you the full. So
that's what I watch.
I have that hour and 10-minute thing. So like on another video, we could chop that down and go step by step, addressing one thing per video. And I'd be happy to go on your channel.
Yeah, let's do it.
Give your channel a guest star worthy.
Well, that'll help us move to the next level and
it'll get you 2 more views than it otherwise would. Yeah, I'm a big draw to okay. Anyway, here we go. Next clip.
Now, God determines each and every one of his followers to get theological beliefs wrong. How does this not relegate God into a DOD, a deity of deception? What's the relevant difference between a demon who determines all Christians to affirm false theological beliefs and a deity who determines all Christians to affirm false theological beliefs?
Okay. The scripture does unequivocally have instances where God deceives people. No question about it. Jeremiah 4:10 is a good example. The parables where God deliberately tries to weed out those who will not ask questions. I don't know if you consider that to be deception in the classical sense, but that's an example. So Tim, if you watch this, can you be a little bit more careful with precisely what you're trying to say? Because if your claim is only that God does deceive some people, granted.
All right. So parables, Jeremiah 4:10, not deceiving people is not always bad.
Well, I agree with that. If I tell people, if you're hiding Jews in your basement and the Nazis come to your doorstep, the right thing to do is to lie to the Nazis and deceive them, make them think one way or the other that you're not hiding Jews in the basement.
Yeah, that's sort of thing. I mean, lead the spies out the other direction. I mean, that's a justifying work according to James.
Yeah, right. So anyway, CJ here is saying that scripture has instances where God deceives people, and then asked me if I could be more careful. Well, first, if Ed were true, then I could not be more careful. As I've explained in the literature, that carefulness condition, it's what we call it. The carefulness condition is not compatible with Ed. After all, it's impossible to be more careful if God determines you to think in such a way that misses the mark. It's impossible, metaphysically impossible, for you to be more careful in that situation. So you're simply a passive cog then at the mercy of a deity of deception. But since Ed is false, you could have done otherwise. CJ could have and been more careful here. But I've already addressed this multiple times in writing, in academic journals, on my website, and on videos. In fact, I discussed this matter even last week at the EPS. The Bible is clear that God does deceive those who oppose God's commands, right? So they are in judgment. It's punishment, right? My argument scope is much larger. It's all Christians who are actively seeking to strive God. It's regenerate Christians, right? It's pastors, it's theologians, it's Sunday school teachers, it's YouTubers, and it's everybody else. So note the sum versus the all, and that changes everything. The sum refers to those who deserve to be deceived because they have freely chosen to rebel against God. The all refers to all Christians if they are in active rebellion or not, including CJ Cox, Colton Carlson, Israel Trujillo, and Chris Date. So if Ed is true, then these guys don't stand in a position to know which of their theological beliefs are true and which are false. And we'll get into that in more detail soon. But be that as it may, this is an undercutting defeater to all of their theological and metaphysical beliefs, and that will ultimately lead to epistemic meltdown. But yeah, do you have some more to play? Or
there's like 10 clips here.
Okay.
Kyle Kringle says deception isn't sin. Deception for no good reason is sin. I like that for a self-serving reason. That back in January, I was deceiving my wife for about 36 hours to get her to her surprise birthday party. So it's like, and
we're going to talk about surprise birthday parties here in a bit.
Okay. Am I bad?
No.
Okay.
And well, okay, just hold that thought. If you play the clip, Colton brings up surprise birthday parties, and we'll talk about that.
Yeah, but I agree. I don't have a problem. I mean, like, there's a lot of stories, like in is it First Samuel 6? I can't remember, where God causes the troops to all be confused and they start killing each other before the Israelites go and wipe them. I mean, stuff like that. Yeah, I mean, and a lot of that is done for judgment purposes, right?
Exactly.
So I don't. That's not like an own against free will. And I still don't even think those things require determinism. They just require God to be as wise and clever as he is. And he does things to do that in the way that I can do things to confuse people and all of that that's appropriate to a human can do. Well, how much more so can God do? And it doesn't, that doesn't even seem to, determinism seems to be an extra gratuitous step to a lot of these kinds of cases, going back to Acts 2, 4, Genesis 50. Yeah. Anyway, next clip. This is still that same question. This is another response to it.
Let's just assume that, yes, God determines some false theological beliefs. What is the relevant difference between like that and a demon who determines some false theological beliefs? My answer is just the intentions. I think it's very, very simple. The intentions of the determiner. So just because the material cause is wrong, so let's just assume that if God does determine me to have a false theological belief, the fact that I have an epistemically false theological belief is somehow wrong or blameworthy for me to have that belief, given all things considered. It could just be that, yeah, God determines the material cause and he is the material cause of it, but that doesn't mean he's the formal cause. That doesn't mean that he actually intends in the same way that I would intend if I try to deceive, like, let's just say Chris or CJ or whatever, or my wife, even for good purposes. So I think that is the number one thing I would say. There's so many counterexamples that literally are ripe. Like, I'm thinking of the Nazi situation with the Jew. Like, that is obviously an instance of good deception where it's morally permissible. And I think that we can say that there's many instances where it is morally permissible for me to deceive somebody, that is, it's not a wrong thing, like epistemically blameworthy for me, for that to happen. And so really, I'm taking a hardline reply. I think that, let's just say, yes, God is a deceiver. Is that necessarily bad? And I would say no, per se, because of all these different counterexamples. Let's just say S determines that P believes a falsehood. This one comes from Manada a long time, and I really like how he phrased it. So I'm basically quoting him with some things taken out. But let's just say S determines that P believes a falsehood and entails neither that S has lied or uttered a falsehood. I mean, that's very, very clear. So if God determines me to believe a falsehood, that doesn't mean he is, in fact, a deceiver, just because I'm deceived, or that he's in fact lied, even though he has determined me to lie. And so what Stratton would need to show is that for literally all X, if X causes or determines or guarantees or ensures that some person S believes a falsehood, then X is untrustworthy. And I think that's the best thing that he wants to try to pack in that question.
All right. I'm it's not clear to me why God would, even with good outcomes, is wanting to determine people to have false theological beliefs. I mean, but I think, okay, I guess. Yeah. I mean, whatever. But
I've never seen somebody misunderstand an argument so horribly. So, I mean, basically, Colton's saying, let's assume the truth of the premise. What's the difference between a deity of deception and a demon of deception? And Colton says, my answer is just the intentions. That response is irrelevant and fails to address the problem. This response makes it clear that Colton does not understand the argument. I've argued that God could have morally sufficient intentions in deceiving all Christ followers. The problem that Colton fails to address here is that if Ed were true, this deity still deceives all Christ followers. This is not an attack on the deity's character or intentions. Maybe one can be made from this, but I'm not doing it. It's merely an argument showing that if Ed were true, we do not stand in an epistemic position to trust the Bible, to trust God, or to possess theological and metaphysical knowledge. And this is what leads to epistemic meltdown and an undermining of Scripture and all that one derives from Scripture. This includes a belief in Calvinism and the assurance of salvation. So let me be clear. Ed Calvinist, right? Calvinists who affirm exhaustive divine determination do not have assurance of salvation, even if they assert otherwise. And as I talked about this in my debate with James White, I got it here in my notes. Let me read it. I said, quote, if a deity of deception assures you of salvation, do you really have assurance of salvation? And, you know, the answer is a resounding no, because undercutting defeaters destroy justification for that belief. Now, Colton then goes on to bring up counterexamples. He says there's so many counterexamples, like a surprise birthday party, and you brought that up too.
I think I have that in the next clip.
See if that's next.
Permitting somebody to be deceived is not synonymous with deceiving somebody.
No, I don't.
All right. Well, Colton
I
brought up
probably cut all that out.
What's that?
I said I probably cut all that out.
Well, I think this is important to discuss because Colton knows better than this. I've already directly addressed this question that he asked in the past, and I answered him directly and published an article about it on my website. So in an article called "What Makes a Deity Deceptive," I responded with the following to Colton. Let me quote it here. It says, quote, "Regarding your wife lying to you about your surprise birthday party, since she has deceived you, now you do not stand in a position to trust your wife on this topic in the future. Indeed, she might tell you that you are not doing anything for your birthday next year, but you have reason to doubt her because she is known to be a deceptive party planner for morally sufficient reasons." Right? So it doesn't mean you can't trust her at all. It's not an attack against her character, but what it means is you're not now in an epistemic position to know if you are, once she's deceived you once about a surprise birthday party. Now, when you ask her the next year, 5 years from now, or whenever, if we're doing anything for your birthday, and she says, no, we're not doing anything, you've got reason to doubt. That's an undercutting defeater. So again, excuse me, in risk of sounding like a broken record here.
So swap birthday party with theological belief that God determined.
What's that now?
So just swap birthday party for theological belief that God determined you to have. Now you have no reason to believe your theological beliefs. That's your whole argument, right?
Yeah, that's right. It's not an attack on his wife's moral character or God's moral character. It's showing your lack of epistemological foundation and you're coming face to face with these epistemic undercutting defeaters that lead to epistemic meltdown on these topics. So again, the surprise birthday party was brought up at the EPS last weekend. And after my response, it was clear that although no one is blaming the wife as immoral for being a deceptive party planner for morally sufficient reasons, she is still nonetheless a deceptive party planner. And so Colton no longer stands in an epistemic position to know if a surprise party has been planned or not. But bottom line, Colton has missed the point of my argument drastically. It does not attack the character, motive, or intentions of God. It simply addresses our lack of theological knowledge, which these four guys all pride themselves in possessing. But if Ed is true, it turns out they don't even have it in the first place. So we can keep going.
Okay. Well, I was going to say, what about a possible defeater that, okay, so my wife now has no reason to trust me on future birthday parties, not I deceived her once. But what about the problem that the fact that I ever planned anything in my life and I did this one time, is that not enough to think that the likelihood, which is pretty likely, that I'll never do this again because it's a hassle, does that not push back a little bit that she may have prior reasons for thinking that based on my past, that I've only done it in one instance, that she has prior reasons to continue to trust the next year or the next milestone birthday, that when I say, yeah, we're not doing that she could. So would that not be a pushback? So if God determined, just because God determined false theological beliefs in the past, doesn't mean that they're necessarily going to do so in the future.
Well, here's the thing. If as soon as the Ed advocate or the Calvinist affirms two things, and they say that God determines all things and that no human on the planet ever has or ever will have a perfect set of theological beliefs. That means that every human has at least one false theological belief, if not multitudes. And the mere fact that there's multitudes of Four Views books shows that even PhD theologians and philosophers are all over the map. So it's not just, hey, God did this once, or your wife did this once, or whatever. It's that God does it to everybody all the time. And there's nobody on the planet right now. There's not some super pope with a perfect set of theological beliefs. So that's the problem. Now,
well, Colton did say that even he doesn't think it's likely, but it is possible that somebody does have a full set of correct beliefs.
Well, and that just shows really how good this argument is. When you have to, saying that, that's like the person objecting to the Kalam, premise one of the Kalam, whatever begins to exist has a cause. Well, maybe there's something that begins to exist that doesn't have a cause. Okay, what is it? Well, every example we have, everything that comes into existence, we can point to its cause, right? So if the universe began to exist, we know that the universe has to have a cause. So I'm like, okay, well, if you think, well, it's possible, my argument doesn't depend on, well, it's possible that God could give somebody a perfect set of theological beliefs. No, does God do that? If so, where is the super pope at? And really, the mark of a good deductive argument is if the premise is plausibly true, not if it's right, if it's probably true. And I've never heard anybody say that premise 1 is probably false. And if Colton thinks it's probably false, show us the evidence. Give us reason to think that there's a super pope out there who has a perfect set of theological beliefs. I can't wait to meet this guy.
You're talking to him right now.
Yeah, well, you're the closest thing we got, but still, you and I, we've had some debates, so I'm pretty sure. Well, I mean, I guess I could be wrong, but don't think I am. So,
well, that again, you could be mistaken about not being mistaken. So let's next response.
Determining somebody to be deceived is not synonymous with deceiving somebody.
Yeah, I cut that out. I thought that was an interesting quip there from Chris, that determining someone to be deceived is not the same thing as being a deceiver. What do you make of that? Again,
I think this is another example of playing a semantic game while ignoring the problem of his own epistemological meltdown. If he says determining someone to be deceived is not synonymous with deceiving somebody. All right, look, if God determines all things and Chris has false theological beliefs, then God has determined Chris to affirm false theological belief. God has used his power. God provides the antecedent conditions sufficient to necessitate Chris's false beliefs. If he doesn't want to call that deception, call it whatever he wants, but the term deception is justified and warranted. It makes sense. So he can call it whatever he wants, but he can't escape the problem that God is making him. God provides the antecedent conditions sufficient to necessitate all of his false theological beliefs, and Chris has a bunch of them. So now he doesn't know, he doesn't stand in a position to know which of his beliefs are true and which are false. And if that sensation of analyzing these beliefs to try to figure out which are true or false is also determined by the same deity of deception that caused the false beliefs in the first place. Now that's like going to wondering if CNN is fake news. So you go to fact checkers to find out, and they tell you, no, CNN is not fake news. But then you find out that CNN was employing those fact checkers. So you haven't gained any epistemological progress there. It continues to melt down. The whole project crumbles. So that's the problem. They're just playing semantics at this point.
The epistemic meltdown that you're talking about is not the same thing as saying, we're not saying that Chris is having an existential meltdown over this problem. What he's saying is he has the problem whether he recognizes it or not.
That's exactly right.
Things. Right.
Yeah. He can say he doesn't have it all day long, but the clear-eyed folks who are thinking rationally here can see it a mile away.
Yeah. The problem with what I have with the statement he made is it's to me, it's beside the point, because just because you determine someone to kick a football doesn't make God a football kick. Okay, well, that's not the issue. The issue is, why is the person kicking the football in the first place on EDD?
Right. Colton talks about quoting Paul Manatta, who says,
"Yeah, we'll get there. I've got more to say."
Okay.
We'll get there, because I thought, I mean, clever, but
is it though? I mean, we'll see. We'll find out.
It isn't. Every time I try to be nice. Okay. Next, this is the final clip on that particular question.
Over some examples. I guess there are some of to quoque. This Colton already did a case, but I'll do like a U2 type of argument. So, for example, if your parents determined you to be born and stuck in North Korea, I mean, you were determined because you didn't choose where you would be born, and you're determined to stay there because they don't let anyone out of North Korea without being killed. I mean, you can still be justified for your beliefs, even if you
determining somebody to be deceived is not synonymous with deceiving somebody.
Determined to have false logical beliefs, you would still be justified. So, for example,
what's going on there?
To be born and stuck in North Korea.
Okay.
So, going over some examples, I guess there are some of to quoque. This Colton already did a case, but I'll do like a U2 type of argument. So, for example, if your parents determined you to be born and stuck in North Korea, I I mean, you were determined because you didn't choose where you would be born, and you're determined to stay there because they don't let anyone out of North Korea without being killed. I mean, you can still be justified for your beliefs, even if you happen to have some false theological beliefs and are determined to have false theological beliefs. That you would still be justified if you happen to have a true theological belief. And I guess the determinism will be relevant in this sense. Say for a jail, I guess in a jail you could be coerced to go to that jail, or in hypnosis you could be coerced into having, let's say, a good argument. Let's say that Welty or James Anderson would hypnotize me and put me like some awesome argument for determinism that is justified. It would be I would be determined to believe so, but it would still be justified if and only if it logically follows. So it would be trustworthy in a sense. You also see deception in sports, and when we deceive in sports, we don't think that we are indeed not trustworthy. I mean, we do feints in football, soccer, in baseball. It's many of these sports are about deception. Yet you wouldn't just trust Tim Stratton if he plays football. I guess we'll never talk to him because he's not a trustworthy guy. I guess it wouldn't even work. And if there's another way in which I think football. Usually proponents of libertarian free will also have some sort of determinism is that when you ask them about Hebrews 1:3 about God sustaining all things, they usually say that they do an argument like, oh yeah, look, like for example, I can sustain a platform and have some free will creatures just acting in that platform, or I can or a doctor can sustain the life of a patient and the patient's just being alive. But if you think about it, so imagine the doctor has a button where he's sustaining the life of Hitler while Hitler does the killing of 6 million Jews. I mean, he'll be determining them, even if you say that, oh, he did it on his own libertarian free will. But I mean, how is this deity not morally culpable under the worldview of Stratton, under his own objections?
All right. You want to set that up, or you want me to just go? All right, I can't hear you.
Oh, yeah, I was saying, you go ahead and go. For 2 weeks now, I've been trying to explain what Israel's saying. So I'm just going to let you explain it this time.
All right.
Because Braxton and Leighton didn't want to. Anyway,
yeah.
So that fell to me, but I'm going to let this fall to you.
So much to say here. Okay, first, so many things he said. Talked about, faking somebody out. If you do a pump fake in basketball and you get the guy to jump in the air and then you go underneath them and shoot the layup, is that fake, that pump fake or that shot fake deception? Well, yes, it is. And now he says, but does that mean he's not trustworthy? Well, it does in basketball. You'd be stupid to try to play defense on him and try to and assume that he's no longer going to try to deceive you on the basketball court. And so now do that with theological beliefs in God. Right? That's the problem here. If God is going to determine all of your false theological beliefs, then and metaphysical beliefs, now every theological and metaphysical counter you offer is already suspect. It's already undercut. It's got an undercutting defeat or facing it. Now, even in the last one, we didn't get to it, but even Colton brought up Greg Welty's bullet bill to quoque objection, and now Israel's doing it here. So let me discuss this really quickly, because this was brought up at the EPS last week as well. And look, and I pointed out to that group of PhD philosophers and theologians this issue here, and they all got it, right? I mean, it came up twice, and I stopped after the second time it came up, and I said, let me explain something here. So what Colton and company and Israel are doing here is not just a tu quoque objection, but they are doing a tu quoque fallacy. It's a fallacy here, the way they're doing it. And this is because I am not making a case for Molinism here, right? You did not have me on to make a case for Molinism. You had me on to ask questions to Calvinists that I thought were deal breakers, right? Now I'm making a case against EDD, exhaustive divine determinism. I'm making a case against Ed, full stop. I'm not making a case for Molinism or anything else. So to respond, well, if it's a problem for me, then it's a problem for you, is a fallacy, as I expressed last week at the EPS. After somebody brought up Welty's bullet bill objection, I said, I noted that I'm simply making a case against Ed. I am not making a case for Molinism here and now. Now, with that said, I do think that the bullet bill tu quoque objection, I don't think it works against Molinism. And I've explained why. But let's suppose the argument that I've advanced, destroying all these guys' views, destroying Ed Calvinism also destroys Molinism. so be it. I don't care. Let's go find the truth together. Maybe Warren McGrew's mirror dynamic omniscience is correct. But it can't. But if the torpedoes I shoot destroy the battleship of Ed Calvinism, and I'm too close to that explosion, and it simultaneously destroys my submarine of Molinism, I don't care, because I want the truth. So then I say, hey, look, if this argument destroys both of our views, I don't hold Molinism as an idol, right? I want the truth and nothing but the truth. So if that happens, let's go find truth together, and we'll be on the same team. But I'm more committed to the truth than I am to any of my current beliefs. I believe Molinism is the best explanation of all the data. But just as I previously left my dearly held beliefs of Calvinism behind, a decade or so ago, because I recognized that it was false, I'm willing to do the same thing with Molinism. I'm not blindly committed to it, as some of these guys seem to be with Calvinism. But after I made that clear at the EPS, no other philosopher or theologian appealed to Greg Welty's bullet bill objection against Molinism again, because they realized that would be committing the tu quoque fallacy. Now, a lot of objectors on YouTube still don't seem to have received that memo. But with that said, since it was raised, allow me to explain why Molinism has not been shot by bullet bill, even though that's not the point. On Molinism, God is merely a necessary condition for bullet bill's free choices, not to mention all his false theological beliefs and everybody else's. On Ed Calvinism, God is both necessary and sufficient for all the evil, pain, and suffering in the world, all of bullet bill's actions, not to mention all false theological beliefs everybody has. Now, that's a vital difference. The mere necessary condition versus a necessary and sufficient condition. And that's a vital difference, one that the room full of PhDs, philosophers at the EPS understood. And guess what? The most viewed movie in the history of movies helps us to see this vital difference. And Chris Date, more than anybody else, should know this, because he got me a Doctor Strange statuette a few years ago, before he unfriended me and blocked me on Facebook for liking a post that said Calvinism was an illness. And by the way, I defended that claim at the EPS last week. But I digress. Let's consider the Marvel movies, the Avengers movies, Captain America, Civil War, Avengers Infinity War, and Avengers Endgame. The Avengers have single-handedly destroyed Greg Welty's bullet bill objection, because we can compare and contrast Hydra with Doctor Strange and consider the intuitions of the vast majority of moviegoers. As I explained to James White in our debate, Hydra deterministically mind-controlled Bucky. This is why everyone realized that Stark was wrong to try to kill Bucky. He should have been going after the victimizer, not the victim. Captain America, however, correctly realized that Bucky was the victim of Hydra, who determined his mental actions, which led to his physical actions, which eventually killed Stark's parents. But moviegoers cheered for Captain America as he fought to protect Bucky from Tony Stark, because they realized Hydra was the source of Bucky's mental and physical actions. Now, compare and contrast Hydra with Doctor Strange's actions in Infinity War and Endgame. Doctor Strange merely created a feasible, freedom-permitting world in which he knew that although evil would occur, it would lead to the best feasible endgame, hence the title of the movie. That's why Marvel fans all had the intuition that Hydra is evil and Doctor Strange is a hero. So like I said, the Avengers have done their job and soundly refuted bullet bill. But anyway, just know that attacking my argument against Ed by saying, well, it's your problem too, that's a fallacy. And that's all I've got to say about that.
Well, in addition to Warren's gracious offer for you to embrace the dynamic omniscience view, there is, of course, Pritchettism.
And what is that?
Huh?
And what's Pritchettism? I might have to...
Braxton calls it self-loathing Molinism.
Self-loathing Molinism.
Self-loathing Molinism. All right. The next question that you asked of Calvinists, here we go.
As my previous question, if God determines all things, and all Christians, including each and every Calvinist, affirms at least one false theological belief, if not multitudes, then it follows that God determines all of his followers to affirm false theological beliefs. It also follows that God determines you to affirm false theological beliefs. So here's my question. Without begging the question, how do you know that Calvinism is not one of these false theological beliefs?
And secondly, how do I know? Because I have direct acquaintance, of course. There's nothing about determinism rules out any form of epistemological framework. So it doesn't rule out internalism. It doesn't rule out externalism. It just doesn't rule out anything epistemological. And the reason why is because how you come to know something doesn't require an indeterministic condition. So he's saying, oh, how can you know? But he's assuming in that question that an epistemological framework must have an indeterminism condition such that I need to be able to access categorical beliefs of mine, and somehow that should make the difference of how I know something to be true. But there's a reason why most epistemological frameworks don't require an indeterministic condition, is because it doesn't give you a solid framework for how you can know something to be true. Even if you have the indeterminism to be able to say, I can categorically access that belief versus this belief, you still may not know it's this belief, even if you were careful, right? So the idea is, the best thing I can say is, if you are directly acquainted with the reasons or evidence, and that those reasons are founded upon the evidence, biblical, theological, philosophical, whatever, that Calvinism is true, then you are justified. And if you're justified, you can know it. If we take, justified true belief to be true. So God may determine the theological beliefs through my evidence. So he can determine it through the means. And we are justified via direct acquaintance if we take internalism to be true. Let's just assume it. And none of that is incompatible with determinism, because internalism doesn't require metaphysical categorical access to choosing varying inductive beliefs. So I can come to know a proposition to be true via direct acquaintance, and that leads me to accept the evidence, even if the evidence was presented to me was in fact determined, because the determined part, the metaphysical piece, is completely irrelevant to whether or not I know something.
All right.
Well, it's funny because when I present this at, to PhD philosophers, the way they try to get out of it is because they realize that the problem is in their face on internalism. And so they say, but what about externalism? And then I have to unpack why it doesn't work on externalism. So, okay. So first of all, let me just say this. Colton is begging the question when he can possess, or that assuming that he can possess knowledge of these things, when my argument exposes the fact that he cannot possess this knowledge if Ed were true. Second, let's discuss what he says about direct acquaintance. Direct acquaintance is an intentional state of consciousness. This is referring to something philosophers call intentionality, which is an ofness or aboutness of things, right? So what is Colton directly aware of when he appeals to direct awareness? Well, the question is this: does God determine Colton's intentional states of consciousness? What Colton thinks of and about, and more importantly, how Colton thinks of and about these things? I mean, people disagree on these things all the time, right? So it doesn't matter if you're directly aware. If that's an intentional state of consciousness and God determines what you think about and how you think about it, a deity of deception can still determine you to get that wrong too. So now, if that's the case, if God determines what Colton thinks of and about and how Colton thinks of and about it, then a deity of deception determines these things too, and Colton cannot trust what he perceives, at least all the time, as direct acquaintance. And if that's not the case, then Ed is false. God doesn't determine all things. And I've explained these things before, from the social media to academic literature, but these guys seem to have missed it. I just want to point people to the paper I wrote, An Explanation and Defense of the Free Thinking Argument. I co-authored it with J.P. Moreland. We discuss the problem with internalism and externalism, why both of those views fail. Colton says that I'm assuming an epistemological framework that must have an...
I wanted to ask, because you're saying he's begging the question, but Colton asked why it is that when you're the one that has the burden.
And I've shouldered that burden and provided arguments. I wrote a whole paper about it with J.P. Moreland.
Yeah.
So, and I'll get into that stuff here, but let me say that he says that I'm assuming. I'm not assuming this. He says that I'm assuming an epistemological framework that must have an indeterministic condition. If that's the case, then he has either not read the paper that I co-authored with JP, or he's not a careful reader whatsoever, because we make a case for this. And so Colton is simply wrong on two counts. Number one, I'm not assuming anything. I've provided arguments. And two, it's more than mere indeterminism that I've argued for that's required here.
Do you know what? Do you know what part of the argument that he thinks you've smuggled in that assumption?
no, because I've just been so clear about what the problem is. I mean, so look again, see the if somebody can start with an easy to read intro on my website, freethinkingministries.com. It's called The Free Thinking Argument for Beginners, right? That start with that and then build your way up and go to the academic journal article called An Explanation and Defense of the Free Thinking Argument. That's free online. But Colton says, you know, how you come to know something doesn't require an indeterministic condition. Well, look, in that paper, I made it clear myself. JP and I addressed this in the footnotes of our paper. The problem, however, is that we can rule this out in the actual world. That is to say, as soon as one affirms both that God determines all things, and two, that God determines all Christians to affirm false theological beliefs, then undercutting defeaters abound and epistemic meltdown follows. And Colton says some other things here, but I'll hand it back to you and see what you bring here.
Okay. We'll go ahead and go to the next clip.
To Calvinism, God does not choose the elect based upon anything about the individual, lest any man should boast, Ephesians 2:9. So those who are passed by, the damned, and those who are elect seem to be based upon luck or chance. Indeed, in Calvinism, the elect seem to have won a cosmic and infinite lottery of sorts. Moreover, those Jonathan, I don't think that's an order. To hell, created for the sole purpose of.
Huh?
I don't think that's an order. I think that's the luck question I had. And I don't think we've even gotten to the prior questions yet. I'm fine with going out of order if you want, but
yeah, for some reason I probably just clipped them differently.
Okay.
I thought I had them numbered in order with like, I think it was 4, 8, 16, and 18.
Okay, well, whatever. You can play it. I'll interact with it.
All right.
Eternal damnation, a decision made by God prior to the birth of the damned individuals. Well, those guys are literally the unluckiest folks in all of creation. So it seems to me that this leaves room for one to boast about how lucky they are compared to the next guy. But here's my question.
I just want to very briefly, before we finish this question, say that doesn't make any sense to me at all. How can you boast in something that has absolutely nothing to do with you, like luck or something? It's just, anyway, sorry. It irritated me the first time I heard it. It irritated me again.
Well, and before you resume and let him make it off the question, I'll just say I agree with you. But another thing that Tim said there that really vexes me greatly is his statement that on Calvinism, the non-elect are created for the, quote, sole purpose of eternal damnation, unquote. That's stupid. That is not something that is that Calvinism has ever entailed. There are all sorts of purposes behind God's creation of the non-elect and behind his reprobating them that extend beyond merely damnation. So I really don't know what that kind of false language is supposed to do in the argument. But anyway, go ahead. We should let him ask his question.
All right. Chris, who doesn't understand why Christians demean each other that way, I do want to point out that he said that your argument was stupid. A week ago, comparable language was used about something that he had said that was made up fantasy, or a phrase that he had said struck me as being meaningless jibber jabber. So I just wanted to put that out there, that Chris thinks we shouldn't demean each other, but yet he uses language like stupid. But if we use comparable language, we're bad, and he will publicly complain on his Facebook wall. So I'll let you decide as the audience what that is. But for us, we don't care that he. Tim, are you upset?
I don't care what he calls me or says about my arguments, or
we don't mind. But if you do mind that kind of thing,
here's what bothers me, because I still consider I want to be friends with Chris, but a couple years ago, as I said earlier, somebody in the Mere Molinism Facebook group made a post about Calvinism being a sickness. Now I can back that up philosophically, logically, theologically. And I did back it up at the EPS. In fact, one of the first questions that was asked to me during the Q&A was from a Calvinist who raised his hand. He said, well, I'm sick, because I talked about how Calvinism was a sickness, but that doesn't mean we don't love the person who's sick or try to help them get better. And so this is a defensible statement. Now, my buddy Phil Bear made a statement about that. I hit the like button. somebody took a screenshot, some spy, some mole, and sent it to Chris, I guess, because he's not part of that group, because I don't think he is anyway. And then he sent me a text saying, lose my number, never want to talk to you again, blah, blah, blah. And I'm like, bro, we have disagreements on that, but we don't have to unfriend each other and block each other. But he hasn't talked to me since. And so I'm just not aware of anybody who considers themselves to be a scholar that actively seeks to block people who are supposed to be a colleague and helping to advance these academic conversations. That's not becoming of anybody who wants to be a scholar, nor is it becoming of somebody who should be friendly and brothers in Christ. Anyway, I would love to be friends with Chris again, and just want to encourage him. You know, if he can say things like this and me not take offense, then I should be able to like somebody's post and him not block me forever. So anyway, let's talk about the statement that damnation is not the sole purpose of their existence, and then him saying that that was stupid. Well, here's the deal. Some Calvinists have argued that this is a purpose, if not the primary purpose, of their existence. And at least we can all agree that it's a major purpose. In fact, this is the most important thing about a person. Are they saved or damned, right? So if he says there's other purposes too, okay, fine. Semantics. This is a big deal. Indeed, John Piper has written that God has a desire to save all people, but you see, God has an even greater desire for his own glory, and thus it's out of his control. He's got to play the cards he's been dealt, and he must damn the vast majority of people to hell because of that. Now, it seems absurd to me. It definitely seems to contradict the God revealed by Jesus in Scripture. But, you know, Calvin was clear that the damned are doomed from the womb, and this is the most important thing. This is the most important thing in life. It's heaven or hell. And according to Calvinism, God determines the most important thing about a person prior to that person's existence, before they've had one thought, before they've committed any sins, before they've even taken a breath. God has determined their eternal destinies. If they're going to suffer in eternity in hell, I know, well, Chris doesn't hold that view, but I bet the other three do believe in eternal hell. Like Chris has the problem. Has God decided to damn a person and snuff them out of existence to be eternally separated from God and all that's good, or not? And also, to bring up Chris's view, I might be wrong here, but correct me if I'm wrong. As far as I can tell, I believe he thinks that all babies who die are damned. I think that's
I think his view would not all babies, but that God is justified in damning babies and electing babies. I think his view is the same as James.
Okay. Well, that's fine. But those babies, I mean, think about that. The babies who are damned to hell, who never reached the age of accountability. I mean, even the American court system recognizes the age of accountability, right? If there's a 6-year-old who robs the bank, he doesn't go to jail, right? But a baby who's going to die is going to wake up on the other side of death, suffering in hell. Well, again, in Chris's view, he's just going to be annihilated. Right. But anyway, it seems to be unlucky, whatever the case might be. Just unlucky, especially if the people who are chosen not based on anything about that person, lest they could boast. And so if it's not lucky, call it whatever you'd like, but it sure seems lucky.
Yeah. And to me, as far as the boasting goes, we did talk about that last week on the stream. I think all four of the panelists have a misunderstanding of how to exegete passages that talk about boasting or whatever, because the point is not that well, anyway, you go listen last week. The point is not that we have to find some sort of theoretical belief system that sounds pious enough that it leaves no room for, but it's more of a social thing about if it's by grace, that's patronage language versus works, which is employment, which incurs wages. And so it's not that you can't come up with a reason to boast. But it's shameful behavior too, because the salvation by grace is something you could never have secured on your own, which is if you do the work, you can secure a paycheck on your own, which if you read Zebra Crook, securing on your own is like the primary thing. And then merited or unmerited is like secondary issue as far as grace is concerned. Reconceptualizing conversion was a great dissertation that kind of spells all this out. But I do want to say this. I actually think we're going to be on the subject, accepting their premise and their understanding. Calvinists do like to say, well, there's nothing about me that has anything boast that I could boast about why God chose me for salvation, because he chose me, so it has to do with me, and that fulfills his reasons and purposes for his glory, for reasons I may not know, but it has to do with I was chosen for reasons that have nothing to do with me but God, and therefore how fortuitous, or one might say lucky, I am that his divine purposes work out great for me. And I think that the possible boast of I'm fulfilling God's eternal purpose for his glory in my election is a bigger brag than saying I'm more spiritually sensitive than my neighbor, if that phrase actually means anything. So, you know, I say that your argument actually works rather well, you know, because it turns out that the bigger boast is the fortuitous luck, and I'm fulfilling a purpose, whereas Leighton says he's just more spiritually sensitive or humbler. So go figure. Y'all can weigh that out, which sounds like the better boast to me if we're talking about boasting like this anyway. So I just want to reiterate what I said last week. Also, nobody does either one. So, and why? Because it would be socially unacceptable and shameful behavior to behave that way.
Mm-hmm.
So there you go. Yeah. Anything you want to add to that?
No, let's keep moving.
Okay.
Deity of deception argument. Premise 1. If Ed is true, then God determines all Christians to affirm some false theological beliefs. 2. If God determines all Christians to affirm some false theological beliefs, then God is deceptive, and his word, the Bible, cannot
I don't know why this is not working.
be trusted, and Christians can consider the deity of deception argument. Premise 1. If Ed is true, then God determines all Christians to affirm some false theological beliefs. 2. If God determines all Christians to affirm some false theological beliefs, then God is deceptive, and his word, the Bible, cannot be trusted, and Christians cannot have assurance of salvation. 3. God is not deceptive, his word can be trusted, and Christians can have assurance of salvation. 4. Therefore, God does not determine all Christians to affirm some false theological beliefs. And 5. Therefore, Ed is false. So here's my question. With this argument in mind, what justifiable reasons do you have for believing what was inspired by a deity of deception? Why should you believe the Bible if it were inspired by a deity of deception?
All the same stuff that we've already said before. The last thing I would have to say is there is prima facie evidence for God being deceptive with just normal basic things. And Eric Weilenberg actually has an excellent article, Divine Deception. It's in a book, New Essays on Skeptical Theism. He basically argues that the claim that, oh, if you believe in Christ, then you'll have eternal life with him. If you hold that God is deceptive in some way, shape, or form, then that claim itself, that if you believe in Christ, then you'll have eternal life with him, could be subject to divine deception, and it may or may not be true. And so all that to say is, I don't think this is particularly a Calvinistic deterministic problem. I think this probably, or could be broadly, a Christian problem, especially if the Bible clearly states, as CJ has already said, of like episodes or scenarios of divine deception. And I think there is. I think Abraham and Isaac is a clear case of divine deception. There's no way that Abraham thought, if we look at just the straight up text, that that God did not want him actually to sacrifice his son. To Abraham, God said, sacrifice your son. And so Abraham must have thought, I will actually sacrifice his son. And he has no reason to think that God is lying or not truthfully wanting him to kill or sacrifice his son. Because of that, he actually believed that he will sacrifice, and that God wants Abraham to sacrifice his son. But clearly that's not the case. That's not what God wanted.
So there are cases where God wants one thing, but or asks of one thing, but really has another idea in mind for a situation. So like with Abraham and Isaac, I think it's important just for broader context that, you know, Paul seems to think at least that Abraham trusted God enough to think that, well, if this is going to be the fulfillment of the promise, then even if I kill him, God's going to still be able to fulfill the promise, which might include something like resurrection or whatever.
Right.
But with that in mind, I mean, to his point that God may have a reason for withholding or deceiving you or withholding information to test you to do something. But then, you know, and lead him to believe it so that he will attempt it until God stops him. That seems to be what Colton's saying here.
Yeah, let me just address a few things. I mean, again, to sound like a broken record, as I explained last weekend at the EPS, in Scripture, God only allows deception to those who oppose him or who are in sin as an act of judgment. So I explained at the EPS, if one examines his life and does not see a commitment to living in sin, then one does not have justification to believe that God would be determining him to be deceived about theology and ultimate reality, right? One is not facing undercutting defeaters anyway. If, however, one comes to see that he has made something an idol, perhaps Calvinism or determinism has become one's idol. I think I've seen that in people before. Then one has reason to doubt their beliefs about reality, right? How we see in Scripture how God lets people's hearts be hardened, right? I think he allows people's minds to get hardened too, especially when they keep digging in their heels and they won't be reasonable and they're going to, they're not going to back down or give up their beliefs because they're too committed to their beliefs rather than the truth, right? Now, look, this is another good reason for Christians to strive to hate sin and to live according to the law of Christ. If you are actively living in sin, you have reason, you at least have some undercutting defeaters to the way you're thinking about reality. Now, regarding Abraham, I don't know what Abraham believed specifically about God. Scripture's underdeterminative there and doesn't tell us. But I contend that God did not determine Abraham's false beliefs if he had any. He simply issued a command for Abraham to ultimately learn from. And that's basically, hey, put God first. And if you do that, you can trust him, even when life doesn't make sense, right? But I don't think we have reason to believe that God was determining his false beliefs here. Pass it back to you.
Well, I was saying that there does seem to be a difference between determining someone to have a false belief and then just, setting up this scenario with Abraham to see if he will do a thing before he does it. That doesn't mean that God determined Abraham going along with the thing. And, so I think that becomes a complete wash, really.
Yeah. My argument is about if God determines all people to have false theological beliefs, then that's going to lead to epistemic meltdown. And so saying, well, what about Abraham? It doesn't follow. Deal with my argument.
Josh is trolling you in the comments, by the way.
I'm not looking at the comments. What's he saying?
Oh, I put it up on the screen.
Oh, let me switch over here. I was looking at my notes.
It was funny. Yeah, he was saying, we get it. Yeah. Okay, Tim, we get it. You were at EPS. We get it.
I'm going to keep talking about it. I loved it. It was such a good time. I saw some of the guys there. Like I saw their faces get red. I saw that it hit some nerves, but they're professionals.
You get out of town.
No, they're professionals though. They took their thoughts and their feelings captive and they remained respectful. It was a logical conversation the whole time. And I really gained respect. The room was packed. It was a lot of fun. Made some new friends there too.
Some more on this previous question here, and then we got one more clip after that. And then because we're doing good on time, you'll be able to address some things in their video that we didn't get to in the clip.
No, but seriously, I do think there's a level of, I don't know if this is Tim's intention, but this line of argument, deity deception, kind of appeals to your more emotive way of reasoning. You know what I mean? Like, you're saying God's a deceiver, and therefore you must be wrong. And I think it gets people to leave their mind and start thinking with their heart, if that makes sense, which is always dangerous in conversations like this. Again, I don't know if that's what Tim's intending to do, but I do think the argument does have that effect on people, and that does make it a fairly popular one.
Right.
I actually agree here because, but I agree it has that effect on people, but I don't agree that that's your intention. Sometimes ideas in philosophy are constructed in a way at the fringes so that it sharpens your focus to what the stakes are, right? And that could be related to somebody having an emotional reaction to it, but that's their reaction to something that's being tested at the edge is not the same thing as it being an appeal to emotion, right?
Yeah.
So I see what he's saying, that it could, your argument could arouse emotions in response, but that doesn't mean that the purpose of the argument itself is to elicit emotional responses. The purpose of the argument is to get you to think about something with the stakes being ratcheted up high as that of course it's going to be emotional, but it's not an emotional argument.
Well, yeah, the problem is people get emotional about their theological beliefs. People get emotional about Calvinism. People get emotional about determinism and free will issues. Unlike any other topic, I mean, it's almost unlike any other topic among Christians and even naturalistic atheists who are also determinists. I mean, people start to lose their mind. It's almost like Trump derangement syndrome. It's like free will derangement syndrome. As soon as you start talking about these things, some people get emotional. It's not the argument that's emotional. It's the fact that you've got an emotional attachment to your beliefs. But I get it because of that, because my argument is going after these beliefs that people are emotionally attached to. It touches nerves, but all I'm seeking is the truth here. And if a view makes it impossible to possess knowledge, then this view, as Victor Reppert has said, is a prime candidate for rejection. And like I said, last week, it was just so fun to interact with scholars who could bracket their emotions and have a logical conversation. But nobody left their mind in that room. Nobody left their mind and argued with their heart, as CJ said. It was a philosophical, academic discussion, and it was beautiful. It was much different than the kinds of things we get here on YouTube. It was a nice retreat from the internet, actually going to that conference.
All right. Last clip. I like this one. It was my favorite one because you brought the puppet. So I love it. It's dear to my heart. I've said it on each of these streams that we've done this. Puppets and action figures all day long until you give me a reason to stop thinking it. Nobody has. Here we go.
The Oxford Dictionary online. A puppet is defined as a person under the control of another person. Sorry. All right. Merriam-Webster defined puppet this way: one whose acts are controlled by an outside force or influence. Cambridge defines puppet like this: a person whose actions are controlled by someone else. Well, we can add to these definitions. A puppet is a created thing that is fully controlled and determined by antecedent conditions, namely the decisions of the puppeteer. Now, if exhaustive divine determination, Ed, is true, then humans are created beings who are fully controlled and determined by antecedent conditions and another personal being, God. That is to say, according to Ed, God exhaustively determines the physical and mental actions of every human all the time. So here's my question. If a puppet, by definition, is a created thing that is fully determined by antecedent conditions, the decisions of another personal being, how is humanity anything different than a puppet if Ed is true?
Difference. It nails the head. And what does Bignon say? Consciousness. And so there is a relevant difference that is clearly uncontroversially true for all parties, that is relevant to moral responsibility and free will, and that is that humans have consciousness, right, where puppets do not. Now, you could go back and forth and say, oh, well, is the consciousness determined? That itself is a different argument. So like you can argue or counter-argue that over and over and over again, but then it's a different argument. And so if we're looking at just the puppet analogy, I'm saying just consciousness is the one relevant difference, regardless of whether or not the consciousness is in fact determined. It doesn't matter. So I'll conclude with saying, honestly, and I really am not being mean, but I really want to ask, did you read Bignon's book, yes or no? And if you did, then can you go line for line and say whether or not you're pressing it in terms of a hard or weak analogy and why, and then how you can get out of the consciousness aspect without just retorting back, but the consciousness is determined.
All right. My only comment here is, aside from being unconvinced that you can't retort back with that, because
right.
I see no reason why because it does nothing against the puppet argument. All it does is it makes somebody having an awareness that they're a puppet. That's one of the most absurd responses I've ever heard. It's like, hey, here's an objection. Whatever you do, don't use the one answer that destroys the objection. You can use anything else, but don't use the one thing that shows that our objection fails. Right.
Go. Right. That's
right. Because Bignon says so.
Right. And let me tell you. All right. So Bignon says that consciousness is the relevant difference. That's what Colton agreed to there. But that response fails. As I've been able to and careful to explain, human consciousness is also determined by this deity of deception. Sorry, Colton. I know you don't want the truth. You like anything but the truth, but all of what one thinks of and about and the manner in which one thinks about these things are all determined by the supernatural puppeteer. So to reiterate what I said earlier about Bucky and the Avengers, Bucky, like he possessed intentional states of consciousness. Nobody doubts that, but he was still the puppet of Hydra, right? Joe Biden, most people say he was a puppet. right? Probably a George Soros or who knows, right? They just found out that all of his signatures, or a whole bunch of them anyway,
The
were from
auto pen.
an auto pen,
Yeah,
and not
that
him,
was weird.
right? Just because Joe Biden has consciousness doesn't mean he's not a puppet. That's one of the most irrelevant responses I've ever heard. So Bignon and Colton are going to need more than mere consciousness to get out of this trap. Because, you know, that's why I was careful to set up my question the way I did. I started out with definitions, and then I said, we can add to this. If a puppet is something, a created thing who is entirely determined by someone else, that is a puppet. And if one's physical and mental actions, their conscious, intentional states of consciousness are all determined by that someone else, how is that not a puppet? To say, well, there's conscious, no, and it's consciousness, and that does the trick. And I say, yeah, but God's determining that too. Everything about the puppet is determined by the puppeteer. Everything about the human, including consciousness, is determined by the puppeteer. We see Bucky and the Avengers had consciousness, still a puppet of Hydra. We see Joe Biden, he still has consciousness, maybe barely, but still a puppet. And so this doesn't get you out of any traps here.
Yeah.
So, yeah, go ahead.
I was going to say, and it's nowhere near as good as the original, but the 2014 remake of RoboCop is great too.
I love it.
Yeah, because it seems like they were able to control him, but he thought that he was the one in control.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah,
and
right.
he kind of goes on autopilot, but he still has awareness and everything else. And I think that to me is just because you're consciously, you have conscious states. Okay. So you say determined or not doesn't mean anything, but you can be conscious of your own puppet status if that's what you've concluded. Now, according to Ed, you don't have any epistemological certainty to even conclude that, because you can't believe anything rationally on determinism. Yeah. But say you come to that conclusion, however you come to, that doesn't mean the conclusion's wrong, but you have no reason to trust it. And if you have consciousness of, well, there are moral categories that I'm involved in right now, and I'm a puppet, but there's still moral. Okay, you can sort out compatibilism however you like to in your mind, but the problem is all of that is determined too, and you can't just say, well, that destroys our argument, so don't say that. You know, because that seems to be what's going on here.
Yeah. So that was the last question that you had, right?
Yeah. So I know that, like, we link to their thing so that they can do this, but we're not doing a start and stop epic stream. But we do have some time. And so if there was anything else in there that you wanted to address here, go ahead. Because, you know, like I said, I take ownership. I made the clips because I was trying to condense everything down to fundamental bytes so that we didn't play hours and hours of their content, respond with hours and hours of ours. So,
well, I took a lot of notes while watching this video yesterday, and so I have so much more. I think I've got 32 pages of notes here that I'm looking at. Okay,
that's over preparing.
Well, you know, I just thought I'd like to be thorough. But let me address one thing that Colton said. He said that Paul Manata says, hey, just because God determines us to drink beer, then that doesn't mean that God's a beer drinker, and so on and so forth.
God determined us to lift weights doesn't mean that God's a weightlifter, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I don't think that that's what anyone has actually said.
No, right. Now, let's think about this. I mean, first of all, I respect Paul. And if anybody would like to see my long back and forth with Paul Manata over this argument, just search his name on the Free Thinking Ministries website. I've responded to, I think, every word that I've seen him post about me. Second, I would say this is a mere semantic game in order to avoid the main point of the argument. So again, it logically follows that one, if God determines all things, and two, all people affirm some false theological beliefs, then God determines all of our false theological beliefs. That just follows logically. So if God determines all Christians, and everybody else, by the way, to affirm false theological beliefs, then God is an untrustworthy source of theological beliefs. You cannot trust him to give you true beliefs on theological matters, right? You know that sometimes he's going to give you the false ones. Even if it's for morally sufficient reasons, this is not an attack on God's character. Now, I refer to a being who is an untrustworthy source of theological beliefs and determines everyone to ultimately get ultimate reality wrong. I refer to that personal being as a deceiver. But the argument passes no matter what one calls this supernatural being, this deity. Call him the god of mischief or whatever you'd like. But if God provides the antecedent conditions sufficient to necessitate all humans to possess false theological beliefs, then it's warranted, right? It stands to reason to infer that this deity is a deceiver. But call him whatever you'd like. The problem still remains. So I just say stop trying to avoid the thrust of the argument and just deal with the epistemological problems it poses and exposes. Right? Yes. To Manada's and Colton's point, if God causally determines all humans to drink beer, it does not logically follow that God is a beer drinker himself.
Right. So,
however, it might make God guilty. Check this out. If God is causing all people to drink beer, that might make God guilty of procuring for minors, but it doesn't make God a beer drinker. But these are feeble attempts, really, to show how, these feeble attempts really show how powerful this argument is, because these responses are so bad. The ed advocate must resort to semantic games instead of facing the defeaters that are right in front of their face. And that's what I'm just asking them to deal with.
Well, I like what you said about it would have God causing minors to violate the law if he did that for every single person, because Chris talked about this, talking about in one of his comments about, that's the role of means. Okay. But to me, when I was listening to it, I agree with them that determining me to lift weights does not make me a weightlifter or does not make God the weightlifter. Yeah. Irrelevant, because God determining me to lift weights is why I'm lifting weights. And so this has a feel of, when you introduce means as a way for how certain sins take place, it reminds me of the guns shoot people don't kind of
exactly
way of reasoning, because it's like if somebody is at a nightclub and they want to determine something, they want to determine a young lady have unfortunate things happen to her later in the night, whether by that person or a person's friend or whatever. Well, okay, so the chemicals that he puts in her drink, so that he's determined for her to have a horrible incident later. Well, that thing that he put in the drink is just means. Okay. Mm-hmm. The fact that he is the reason why those means took place makes him culpable. So so if the deity of deception or your mad scientist is behind that person at the nightclub controlling him, then I think you've shown this in an argument somewhere, that the mad scientist controlling the person at the nightclub that's slipping in the chemicals, he would be, if there was an arrest made, they would go find him if they found it. And so that God would be the equivalent of the mad scientist in your example. Yep. So it doesn't matter that God's not a weightlifter because he determined me to lift weights and you to lift weights, and others hopefully would start lifting weights. But that's not the point. The point goes back to your mad scientist argument, because and the mad scientist would be morally culpable in that sense. And I think that's our problem. I did want to show something real quick, and it's stupid, but you said 32 pages, and that's my notes. So, but I think I do think your method is actually better, because when you make notes like that, you have it to repurpose for other things without having to recreate it.
Yeah, I'll probably make some blog articles out of this.
Right. And that's the thing that's the thing I want to take from you, is to actually make more notes when I do this kind of stuff, because I can save all of these notes and make them even more robust so that I don't have to type out the same things over and over again. So I really like your thoroughness.
Well, I'm scrolling through my notes here. I think I want to make another comment about the internalism, externalism thing. I do have some stuff on this coming out in a book. JP Moreland and I did discuss this in our paper. And I would just say that, both JP Moreland and I are internalists, but in our paper, we express why ed is a big problem for both the internalist and the externalist. In fact, I discussed these matters with Dr. Tyler McNabb, who is a well-known externalist epistemologist, and I footnoted him in my paper. I've also talked with doctors Tim and Lydia McGrew, who are leading epistemological internalists. And Tim has previously given my argument his stamp of approval. And Lydia, in conversation, has told me that she thinks I'm onto something, on the right track here. So I just want to say that Colton seems to be very confident in what he's talking about here regarding epistemology, and he's not aware, talking about being aware of and about things. He seems to not be aware of the problems that, if we're going to say that God determines all things, then God is determining what you're aware of, and and how you think about it, including all the false things you think about. Now, I have, and JP Moreland and I discuss this in our paper as well. We discuss how we have a direct acquaintance of the fact that we possess libertarian freedom, that we notice the difference and have a direct acquaintance with passive thoughts that are not under my control, and active thinking, which is under my control, which seems to make sense of scriptures in 2 Corinthians 10:5, to take your thoughts captive to obey Christ. It's very active language, but you don't have that active power to do that kind of thing if all of your thoughts are passive. And so the Ed view here is just flies in the face of scripture. But with direct acquaintance in mind, I have direct acquaintance of the difference between passive thinking that seem to be determined by other things, by antecedent conditions, and my active agency, my active thinking, when I'm deliberating and being careful to think things through and things like that. Which again, I argue that carefulness condition is not compatible with Ed. Now here's the thing. I have direct acquaintance that I am much more than a passive cog, and that I have libertarian freedom, with the power to take thoughts captive and the power to take the way of escape when I'm in a deliberative situation facing temptation to sin. I can sin or take the way of escape. I've experienced that, and I have direct acquaintance that I have the libertarian freedom to take. Yeah,
that was the question that Braxton had asked, and we actually addressed that in more detail on the first stream. Just wanted to make note of that.
Right. My point is this: I have direct acquaintance of my libertarian freedom, and that I'm not always determined by something or somebody else, especially all of my mental actions. I am a free thinker in the libertarian sense, at least sometimes. I have direct acquaintance of that. Now, if Colton says I have direct acquaintance of the opposite, well, now God's determining one of us to have direct acquaintance that's false, and the other one of us to have direct acquaintance that's true. And now we're right back to the same deity of deception argument. It's better to say one of us is not being as careful as the other person. But again, that is going to get us into the carefulness condition, which I've argued is only compatible with the libertarian position, that we are libertarian free thinkers who God has determined and created, intelligently designed and fine-tuned. And I discussed this in the JP Moreland paper, right? Our cognitive faculties are like a sniper rifle. And it's a sniper rifle is an intelligently designed, fine-tuned machine that is designed to hit targets miles away, right? And maybe not miles, but you get the point. Some are miles, I guess. Anyway, so imagine this sniper rifle. Now, the sniper rifle is not going to hit the target on its own. It needs a sniper who trains with it, who does his due diligence, who is careful with it, who practices with it over a long period of time. And if he's careful with it after developing that skill, if he's careful with it, he has the power to hit metaphysical, or I'll say to hit those targets of truth. And the same thing is true with our cognitive faculties that are like a sniper rifle. As philosophers and theologians, we, more than anybody else, we're like those snipers. The sniper equaling the person, right? We have a sniper rifle with the cognitive faculties that God has designed, and he's designed it so that we can hit the target of metaphysical truth, metaphysical miles away. But that doesn't happen on its own. It's when we're careful and we do our due diligence and we practice and gain these skills and sharpen our skills, then we can hit the target of metaphysical truth miles and miles away, if we're careful and if we choose to be responsible and to handle those powers that God has given us responsibly. So that is, and I explained this to the room full of philosophers, and I ended it by saying, hey, this is why we all need each other, because part of this is reasoning together. Isaiah 1:18, God has created us in such a way. So even when we are disagreeing on these topics, we come together us more than anybody else as PhD philosophers and theologians coming together and sharpening each other so that we can all get to the target of truth and hit that target of truth better than anybody else on the planet. And I think that Christian theologians and philosophers are in a position to do that better than anybody else because Christianity is true. That's another topic, but that's all I got to say about that. You're muted. Can't hear you.
Okay, so they asked a question in their stream that they turned back on us, and Braxton, Layton, and I have all answered it. So it's your turn to answer their question. And I think it's a fair question. It's a good question, interesting one. So I'm going to play their question for us, and you can, if you need to think about it, go ahead and think about it.
Yeah, because you haven't shared this with me before.
Firstly, I'd like to ask, guys, we in good faith decided to answer this question. I'd like to posit the same question back to you. What are you least confident in about the anti-Calvinist position? Or if, since that's a negative, maybe we could say something else. What element of Calvinism how do I want to word this? What element of Calvinism do you think is most likely to be true? We'll put it that way. All right. What element of provisionism is most likely to be false is another way I guess you could answer it. But I would be very interested in hearing an answer from you guys. All right.
Yeah, so we had asked a question. Braxton had asked them, what are you least convinced of about your own system? And they all did answer it in various ways. And so we decided to actually, since they answered all of our questions, to honor them with the same.
Yeah.
And so what is it about your maybe Molinism or just your soteriology in general or your beliefs on, within this spectrum of debate, whether it's on the philosophical side or the theological side?
Yeah.
What is the one thing that you're like least confident in that you'd like to do more work on, perhaps, or you think is their best argument that maybe you don't believe it, but you think is the best one that gives you pause?
Well, let me just start with what I agree with Calvinism. I agree that God exhaustively predestines all things, from every movement to every subatomic particle, to all of our libertarianly free choices, to the orbits of the planets, and everything else. God predestines all of it. So that's where Calvinists and I mean, that's why I still consider myself to be a Reformed theologian. Again, I have my PhD from a Reformed university, same one that Dr. James White is attending, still pursuing his PhD, as far as I know. And so as a Reformed theologian, just one who rejects Calvinism and exhaustive divine determinism, I am going to stand with the Calvinists and say, yes, God does predestine all things. I know my open theist friends will disagree with me there. Sorry, Warren. I see you're saying booted that. But that's what I think is. But I still love you, man. I still love you. And I still consider, I'm willing to consider your arguments. And again, with Warren, he and I agree on so many things. We're going to stand shoulder to shoulder on, hey, we have libertarian freedom and the power to freely think in a libertarian sense. Anyway, where I agree with the Calvinists is that God predestines all things. But in my book, I explain and deductively conclude that predestination does not entail determination. They're two different things. So, yeah. So God can't predestine without determining. And that's how, that's why I'm a Molinist. If Molinism is true, God can predestine without determining. So God can predestine without violating libertarian freedom. Now, let me say some more things that I agree with the Calvinist. I think that God does determine a whole bunch of things, right? But he can't determine the entirety of our mental actions, right? That's what my arguments are all about. So I also agree that sometimes compatibilism can describe compatibilistic freedom can describe instances of our experience. So, for example, when I go to the restaurant on a Tuesday night, I've discussed this on my website, and I look at the menu, and I have a sense that I am that antecedent conditions are not sufficient to necessitate what I order that night. But at the end of the day, I'm looking to see what I desire most in that circumstance. Now it happens to be Taco Tuesday, and so I see that tacos are on sale, and I love tacos. And so since I get to eat what I love and it's cheaper than the steak, I'm going to order the tacos. Now, that's determined by my DNA, which wasn't up to me, which determines my taste buds. And, all these other antecedent conditions that go into me ordering the tacos. So I'm not saying I'm not going to grant, or at least I'm not going to affirm that is a deterministic scenario. I'm saying that I can see how it could be. And so I could grant it for the sake of argument and say that compatibilism might describe an instance where I'm going to order tacos over the burrito or anything else like that. Now, with that said, I argue that kind of freedom doesn't work when it comes to rationality, right? Because if there I ordered what was my greatest desire at that moment. If I choose my beliefs based upon my greatest desires, then that's the farthest thing from rationality. That's just one thing. So anyway, I'm going to agree with the Calvinist that predestination of all things is true. I'm going to agree with the Calvinist that determinism of some things is true, not all things. That's where we're going to disagree is the all, but we're going to agree on the some. I'm going to agree that sometimes what's referred to as compatibilism can describe instances of our experience. And finally, I'm going to agree with some parts of tulip, but I prefer Trump instead of tulip. I go TRUMP, not to be confused with our president, but just be thinking about playing the Trump card in poker, right?
Gotcha.
The T, total depravity. Guess what? We agree. I agree with the Calvinist there. We might define it differently, but largely we're going to agree. The R is where we disagree. I'm going to say we have resistible, amazing grace as opposed to the irresistible grace of the Calvinist. The U, we're going to disagree. I argue that we have unlimited, or that there was an unlimited atonement as opposed to the limited atonement. The M is middle knowledge of the elect. So I'm going to agree with the Calvinists that there's a sense of election, but it's not a determined kind. God just had middle knowledge of it. And finally, the P, we are going to agree. I'm going to agree with the Calvinist and agree with perseverance of the saints. I'm just going to say it's perseverance of free saints in a libertarian sense. But there's a whole bunch that I agree with when it comes to Calvinism, and that's because they are reformed and so am I. We just disagree on exhaustive divine determinism and certain parts of the tulip.
The question is, out of all of your differences, what are the ones you're least confident in? Or which like maybe you think maybe limited atonement is the one that gives you pause, that you think that could be right, that could be, they have good arguments for that? Or what do you think is your weakest position that needs strength? This is that question that you will get asked when you have to go apply at McDonald's. And what is your greatest weakness? Right. So
it's probably just that I care so much about everybody.
Right.
My greatest weakness. No, I'm just kidding. Man, I mean, of the Trump, I mean, the way I cash these out.
I'm so good. I just have no weakness. There's just nothing.
I guess it would be the M, because I guess somebody could start arguing that middle knowledge isn't metaphysically possible. I think those are the most interesting objections against Molinism. I don't think they pass at the end of the day.
Well, of course not. But do you think that they could give you trouble? I tell you that if we spent an hour off camera talking about it, I could convince you that your P is wrong.
Perseverance of free saints.
Yeah, because that's just another once saved, always saved thing, and that's just...
So you need to go to my website. I have a article called "Once Saved, Always Saved," and while I will agree with the "once saved, always saved," I will disagree on when the salvation happens. I think most people put salvation at repentance, at that first initial instance of repentance, and I say that's a necessary condition of salvation, but true salvation, it's not, the deal isn't sealed until you find yourself in a true love relationship, or at least a maximal or the greatest kind of love relationship where you would never seek divorce from your creator. And since God would never seek divorce from you, and you get to a point where you would never seek divorce from him, then it's once saved, always saved, if that means once in love, always in love. Because when you see two people who are getting married and they express their undying love for each other on their wedding night, and then 2 years later they wind up in divorce. We know that they might have had some strong feelings for each other, but we do know that at least one of them didn't have the best kind of love for the other. And so anyway, all this can actually get us back to what I call monergistic Molinism, where Kirk McGregor has coined that phrase. And so we don't even have to get into synergism here. We can keep our monergism, but that's a topic for another video.
Yeah.
But I encourage people to go to my website, freethinkingministries.com, and check out my article called Once Saved, Always Saved. I affirm it in one sense, reject it in another.
Josh, your ministry partner, says the P is where I'd be least confident. Right. And so I'll spend the hour with you, Josh, and convince you that that should be Tim's least confident one too.
I'm very, very confident in that one.
But you're wrong.
That's my subjective confidence there. You're free to have a different subjective view of it, but you're asking me about my subjective confidence right now, and I'm pretty confident on the P.
Yeah, give me an hour. Or give me an hour with Josh, and he'll show you. Yeah, that should be how you should have answered the questions.
All right, well, let's do that.
Josh is correct. Josh is correct. That is where he.
Hey, I can't wait. I'm going to let the cat out of the bag here. Josh is doing the preliminary work to start his PhD program, and his dissertation topic is just going to be awesome. And I'll just say this. Molinists are going to love it, and there's going to be a lot of weeping and gnashing of teeth coming from the non-Molinists.
So will he make me less self-loathing if I read it? Is that?
Oh, definitely less self-loathing. Yes, I don't know what you mean by that, but
no pressure, Josh. That's the hurdle right there to make me a less self-loathing, because Tim and Braxton have clearly failed. So it's on you, buddy. You're going to have to rise to the occasion to move so that I can stop loathing myself. All right. We appreciate everyone showing up. Tim, what do you got to shout out that's coming up on your channel or in your ministry or even with your music?
Oh yeah. Well, we're getting close. We're getting up to the spring now, and in the spring and summer, I'm on the road quite a bit, touring and bands. I was playing with a guy named Luke Mills. Now he's retired, and he started this, not really a record label, but kind of, and he's got a lot of artists that work under him. And so the rest of the band has stayed together, and now we're backing up these artists. In particular, this young man named Jaden Schumacher, also a guy I'll be sharing the stage with on occasion, who's currently on The Voice, named Jalen. So yeah, there's Jaden and Jalen. It's confusing, but yeah, I'm looking forward to having some fun. I also, when we're on the road, have time to be on my laptop and grade dissertations and get into theological conversations. But yeah, I'm doing that this summer, but I'm still going to be doing work as far as Free Thinking Ministries goes. That's still my full-time job. And I am currently working, it should be done this year in 2025, and I hope out in 2025, the second edition of Mere Molinism. I've said even during the EPS, I thought that I was too quick to publish it in the first place. And I've learned so much in the last 5 years since publishing that first edition, where I think I've learned to be much more philosophically precise. And so there's going to be some major changes. And I would say all the big ideas are the same, at least the vast majority of them. The big ideas are the same, but they'll be defended in a much more philosophically precise and rigorous way, I think. Having a lot of eyes on this thing as well.
Any videos coming up on the channel we need to look out for?
Any new videos? Oh man, yeah. Every Thursday, Josh and I do a live stream together. So tomorrow we'll be doing a live stream, and we've got Joshua Ryan Ferris coming on tomorrow to talk about his recent debate with James White, along with our friends Dan Chapa and Jeremiah. I don't know how you say his last name. Nordier. I don't know. I don't know how you say it. I think I haven't seen it yet, so I got to watch it tonight because like I said, I was on the road.
Yeah.
So I'm going to watch it tonight and tomorrow. And then we're going to have Joshua Ryan Ferris on to talk about this with Josh Klein and I. And we're going to really kind of focus on his opening statement, his opening speech, and then his closing statement. And yeah, so this should be a lot of fun. Like I said, I haven't seen that debate yet, but I'm going to go watch it now.
Yeah, that's at the Free Thinking Ministries here on YouTube. There's probably a link in the description below if Braxton did his job. And coming up on Trinity Radio, Monday, we're going to be getting into Romans 14 on the Biblical Rogues Gallery, Monday night at 6:30. And on, I think it's going to be Friday of next week, we'll be doing this again, where we were going to respond to their responses to the questions that I had asked. And that's going to be a lot of fun as well. So be back a week and a half from now for that. But if you want to get a theological education, here comes the plug again with no smooth segue at all. Go to trinitysym.edu and fill out an eval today. And if you want to support what we're doing at Trinity Radio, financially, we greatly appreciate it. Go to patreon.com/Trinity Radio. And with that, we appreciate everyone watching, and we'll see you next time on Trinity Radio.